Again, thank you all for coming this morning. Hope you've been able to avail yourself of the goodies at the back. And we are so thankful for Randall University, their kind staff who have taken time to be so hospitable, and we appreciate that. And let me remind you again as we begin, all of these are being live streamed on the Randall University YouTube channel, and they're available for replay. And they're being cross-posted at the Commission of Theological Integrity's Facebook page, and we'll have them up some point during the week on our actual website. So we are very, very thankful and appreciative of that. Appreciate your good attention. Thank you for your interaction throughout last night and today, and we are so appreciative. Our next presenter is Adam Blehm. He's the Biblical Worldview Director at Rejoice Christian School. He attends the Rejoice Church there in Owasso, Oklahoma. He holds a BA in Theology from Randall University, MA Theology and Apologetics from Oklahoma Wesleyan, and a Master of Science in Ethics, Epistemology, and the Mind from the University of Edinburgh, and a PhD in Philosophy from the University of Arkansas. His research interests include psychological trauma, virtue ethics, philosophical theology. Been married for 17 years. To his wife, Jennifer, and they have 3 children, Anastasia, Eva, and Samuel. And we are delighted. His paper today will be about a subject that 15 years ago would have not been front and center, but now is on everybody's reading list and radar. He's going to speak on defining man and woman, a comparative account of gender. And it's our privilege to welcome him to the stage this morning. Make him feel welcome as he comes.
All right, well, good morning. It's good to see you all. I've got a handout if you'd like one. It's an outline of the paper. I think that might help with Q&A to follow along kind of what's going on. But I'm looking at this stage and trying to remember, I think one of the last times I was on this stage, we were performing Arsenic and Old Lace. And we had this incident with two of the main characters in our show, that one of them got, I don't remember exactly what happened, but she got really sick about 2 hours before we went on the second night. And she and her fiance left. And I had a friend of mine that was just visiting, and I said, hey, you want a part? And he said, okay. And so I guess the lesson of that is always be prepared. Anyway, so I'm excited to be here. And this paper came about because working at the school, this topic of gender is something that obviously is on the radar. It's a topic of hot debate. And I wanted to be able to think about this well. Not to just brush it off, but to be able to think through it well so that we can respond to our critics well, so that we can raise our students well. Because I know I can think of at least one student, actually several students, that have been in the throes of trying to think through this and wrestling with gender and gender identity and those kinds of things. So in recent years, many Christians have felt increasing conflict with the changing gender paradigm progressively embraced by the wider culture. For instance, on February 21st, 2023, a Christian school in Vermont forfeited a girls' basketball game because the team refused to play a team that included a player who was biologically male and identified as a girl. The head of the school stated, "We believe playing against an opponent with a biological male jeopardizes the fairness of the game and the safety of our players." The school's refusal to play their game violated the Vermont Principals Association's non-discrimination policy, and so the school was suspended from competing in any event sponsored by the VPA. While the school's response does not appear explicitly biblical, their educational philosophy states, quote, "Using God's word, the Bible, as our preeminent textbook, we expose children to every facet of human knowledge and experience through this authoritative filter. Each discipline is examined through the framework of our Christian beliefs and values," end quote. It is quite plausible to think then that the school's view of gender is influenced by biblical exegesis. This article will be structured by developing three main sections. First, I want to facilitate understanding between evangelical Christians and the broader culture by explaining and examining the cultural paradigm and then analyzing the philosophical reasoning underlying it. Second, I examine Scripture, specifically the Genesis creation narrative, to briefly discern how the Genesis creation narrative provides a framework for understanding gender. And lastly, I compare the cultural paradigm with the biblical one. In the end, I believe the framework assumed in Genesis is more coherent and satisfying than the cultural model. However, my focus will not be on trying to answer the question, what is gender? Instead, I want to mainly think about the two related questions, what is a man and what is a woman? The reason for this focus is twofold. First, it is not clear what gender per se means in our culture, nor what significance gender is supposed to have. The second reason for focusing specifically on these questions is that it allows me to explore the beauty of the biblical narrative as it develops a theology of complementarity between men and women. So, the contemporary cultural model. For centuries, the language of gender, man or woman, was used interchangeably with sexed language, male or female. In fact, even today, many languages like Urdu do not have distinct words for sex and gender. But in the last century, gender and sex have been pulled apart, at least in the West. For a concise summary of how much of our culture views gender, let's turn to the World Health Organization's summary of gender and health. The WHO writes, and this is going to be a long quote, gender refers to the characteristics of women, men, girls, and boys that are socially constructed. This includes norms, behaviors, and roles associated with being a woman, man, girl, or boy, as well as relationships with each other. As a social construct, gender varies from society to society and can change over time. Gender is hierarchical and produces inequalities that intersect with other social and economic inequalities. Gender-based discrimination intersects with other factors of discrimination, such as ethnicity, socioeconomic status, disability, age, geographic location, gender identity, and sexual orientation, among others. This is referred to as intersectionality. Gender interacts with, but is different from sex, which refers to the different biological and physiological characteristics of females, males, and intersex persons, such as chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive organs. Gender and sex are related to, but different from gender identity. Gender identity refers to a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond to the person's physiology or designated sex at birth. End quote. Note that there are three primary terms that are used here: gender, sex, and gender identity. Gender is defined as being the characteristics a society generally ascribes to a certain group of people, usually males and females. These characteristics often include social expectations. For instance, it used to be the case that culturally, women were those people who were expected to stay at home and raise children. Thus, part of what woman meant was someone who stays home to raise children. In addition, the WHO asserts that anytime gender is used, it inherently includes an unequal distribution of power. That is, we cannot use the terms man or woman without giving more power to one group than another, usually men. Sex refers directly to a recognition of one's biology. The WHO says that gender and sex are related, but does not explain in what way they are related. As we will see later, if what it means to be a man or a woman is determined by culture, there is no reason to think that gender must be tied to one's biology. Lastly, gender identity refers to how someone feels about the experience of gender. The experience of gender is an ambiguous phrase. What does it mean for someone to experience the, quote, socially constructed characteristics of women or men? To attempt to make the definition more coherent, we might say that gender identity is the way someone feels they should be categorized based on society's expectations of gender. For example, I might identify as a man because I like to go camping, and social expectations dictate that camping is the kind of things that a man likes to do. While the WHO makes a distinction between gender identity and gender, it is important to note the distinction is often not made in practice. Remember that according to the WHO's definition of gender, gender is determined by society, not an individual. However, in practice, many people are often asked to acknowledge that someone's gender identity determines their gender. For instance, in the Standards of Care for the Health of Transgender and Gender Diverse People, version 8, it recommends healthcare providers use the gender or sex language preferred by the patient. Quote, Utilizing affirming language or terminology is a key component of transgender or gender diverse affirming care, end quote. Thus, we are faced with a dilemma. Either the transgender patient is mistaken or the patient determines their gender. If the physician only uses preferred gender language when talking to the patient and not when speaking to other medical professionals, the physician implies that the patient is mistaken. If the patient is mistaken, the physician's use of preferred gender language contributes to and increases the patient's ignorance. If, on the other hand, the patient is not mistaken, then the individual determines their gender. If someone identifies as a woman, we affirm them as woman by using language that applies to women. If we must affirm someone's gender identity as determining one's gender, gender collapses into gender identity. Because the physician is required to affirm someone's gender identity as their gender, the individual patient determines whether they are a man or a woman or any other possibly infinite number of genders. I feel like a man means I am a man. Thus, if we must affirm that someone is a woman because they feel like a woman, gender is not socially constructed, but it is individually determined. But there is a very significant problem if I am a man because I feel like a man. This is because what I subjectively feel determines the definition of man. But if man is determined by my subjective feelings, then man loses the ability to facilitate communication between people. Man comes to mean what I feel like and nothing more. The same would be true of the concept of woman. Thus, the sentence, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body, comes to mean I feel like what I feel like trapped in the body of what someone else feels like. If man or woman comes to be defined in this way, people who struggle with gender dysphoria are robbed of a meaningful way to communicate their experience. Thus, if man and I feel like a man mean the same thing, some of the most vulnerable people, for example, those struggling with gender dysphoria, are effectively silenced. If gender is individually determined, gender language I choose not to adopt for myself comes to signify not any concrete individuals, but only those who feel other than what I feel. Gender then fundamentally becomes a way to signify difference. If I am a man, then a woman is fundamentally someone who feels differently about themselves than I do. Defining others in language that only refers to our differences is a slippery slope that can lead to what some scholars and some people have called othering. Maintaining the distinction between gender and gender identity allows the sentence, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body, to facilitate better communication. However, if gender is merely socially constructed, we have to face at least one important worry. Gender as mere social construction threatens to reduce what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman to stereotypes. For instance, perhaps a culture expects that a woman wear dresses, abstain from joining the workforce, and do not become politically active. Woman, therefore, comes to mean someone who wears dresses, is not part of the workforce, and is not politically active. If this is true, a female who wears pants instead of a dress is therefore not a woman. A female who is the CEO of a company is not a woman, nor is a female who runs for president. But this seems absurd. After all, if woman is culturally grounded in the way I've described, it would be impossible for a woman to protest a culture's gender understanding by flouting gender expectations. If a female flouts the cultural understanding of woman, she is no longer a woman because she does not meet the cultural expectations of a woman. If cultural expectations, at least by themselves, do not determine what it means to be a woman or a man, there needs to be something else that grounds the meaning of man or woman. So far, I've presented and evaluated a current cultural understanding of gender. In short, gender is thought to be either individually determined or socially determined. If it is individually determined, gender collapses into gender identity, and people who identify as transgender lose the ability to communicate their experience. If gender is merely a social convention divorced from biology, terms like man and woman come to be defined by cultural stereotypes. Before proceeding to a biblical account of gender, I want to take a brief look at how we arrived at the current cultural understanding of gender. By considering the development of the cultural gender paradigm, I think we will uncover assumptions that will be helpful in contrasting the biblical view. So how did we get here? The development of the popular conception of gender springs from atheistic assumptions, most notably expressed by Jean-Paul Sartre. According to Sartre, because God does not exist, we must define ourselves. Sartre's well-known dictum, existence precedes essence, means that we exist and come to define ourselves by what we do. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy summarizes the core idea by saying that, quote, a person has no predetermined nature or range of choices, but is always free to choose afresh and thereby reconstitute himself or herself as a different person, end quote. That is, human beings are not just free to make choices about how they behave, they are free to determine the kind of thing that they are. Simone de Beauvoir, an influential neo-Marxist existentialist philosopher who had an intimate and complicated relationship with Sartre, was one of the first to distinguish sex from gender. In her view, sex referred to someone's biology, but gender was about one's experience, and this experience was profoundly determined by social influences. In her most well-known work, The Second Sex, Beauvoir references some popular slogans from her time that seem to indicate that femininity is in jeopardy. She summarizes, quote, we are exhorted to be women, remain women, become women, end quote. Because the concepts of femininity and female can be pulled apart, she concludes, quote, it would appear then that every female human being is not necessarily a woman. So to be considered, she must share in that mysterious and threatened reality known as femininity, end quote. This implies that society sets the standard for what it means to be a woman and that women are those persons who conform to the socially constructed category. Later in the book, Beauvoir writes, quote, one is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychological, or economic fate determines the figure that the human female presents in society. It is civilization as a whole that produces this creature, intermediate between male and eunuch, which is described as feminine, end quote. It is hard to overstate the influence of Beauvoir on this point. Abigail Favale points out, quote, that statement is the mustard seed of gender theory, end quote. So women are not only socially constructed, but people are in the process of becoming women or men. People become women or men because they come to identify themselves with one or the other socially constructed category. Commenting on the significance of Beauvoir's statement, Judith Butler states, quote, the distinction between sex and gender has been crucial to the long-standing feminist effort to debunk the claim that anatomy is destiny. Sex is understood to be the invariant, anatomically distinct, and factic aspects of the female body, whereas gender is the cultural meaning and form that the body acquires, the variable modes of that body's acculturation. With the distinction intact, it is no longer possible to attribute values or social functions of women to biological necessity, and neither can we refer meaningfully to natural or unnatural gendered behavior. All gender is by definition unnatural, end quote. In other words, the distinction and eventual divorce between sex and gender is necessary to undermine the limitations that a connection to biology places on the concept of woman. If sex and gender are distinct, we have more freedom to define man and woman in the ways we see fit. Sartre would be proud. In a prescient comment from the same article, Butler makes the following observation: that one becomes one's gender seems now to imply more than the distinction between sex and gender. Not only is gender no longer dictated by anatomy, but anatomy does not seem to pose any necessary limits on the possibilities of gender. By the way, this is really interesting. She's writing this in the late 80s. In other words, if sex and gender are distinct, and where sex is biological fact and gender is socially determined, there's no reason why gender has to be related to sex at all. If this is true, there can be a potentially indefinite number of genders depending on what society constructs. Moreover, a person's gender need not have any connection to one's biology. So I briefly explored the philosophical underpinnings of modern gender ideology, in part to help explain some things that may seem bewildering to many Christians. For instance, many Christians do not understand why it seems to be the case that many gender ideologues want the rest of society to affirm their beliefs about themselves. A person may follow Sartre's advice in defining oneself, but if gender is merely socially constructed, one's gender identity only becomes legitimate if society accepts a gender category as a concept. If society only accepts the gender binary, it only accepts something like men and women, then those who want to define themselves in other ways cannot legitimate their gender identity because their gender identity is not grounded in anything besides what society agrees on. Furthermore, if society only believes woman to refer to females, then people are not free in the Sartrean sense to define themselves. Second, this philosophical development explains why persons of both sexes identify as any gender. Biology and gender identity have become not only distinct, but completely independent. In essence, the contemporary understanding of gender seems to be a repackaging of the old Gnostic evaluative dichotomy between the physical and the spiritual. Yet if we divorce gender from biology, there does not seem to be any other objective feature that all women or all men share. In her seminal paper, Gender and Race, What Are They? What Do We Want Them to Be? Sally Haslanger points out, quote, if we ask whether females share any intrinsic non-anatomical features such as physiological makeup, character traits, beliefs, values, experiences, or alternatively, whether there is a particular social role that all females have occupied across culture and history, the answer seems to be no, end quote. Because Haslanger believes that gendered language is oppressive, and because the purpose of her project is to deconstruct gender hierarchy, she goes on to define woman fundamentally in terms of oppression, even if this definition omits some people we would normally consider women. Thus, one cannot be a woman unless she is oppressed. To be fair, Haslanger's project is not an attempt to capture what we normally mean by woman, but how we might usefully revise what we mean for certain theoretical and political purposes. In summary, Sartre argued that in the absence of God, we are free to define ourselves. Beauvoir built on this foundation by arguing that part of what it means to define ourselves is that we become women or men according to culturally constructed categories. Thus, biology and gender are not necessarily connected. Lastly, Butler observed that on this view, biology need not play any part in our understanding of gender. Before moving on, I think it is worth mentioning that Beauvoir argues that the concept of woman historically has been a derivative concept. She argues that man is determined by men so that men make themselves. However, woman has always been defined secondarily, and by addition, it's been defined by men. In other words, societies define man by independently attributing attributes to man, but woman has been defined only in contrast to man. That is, woman is always the other, hence the second sex, the title of her book. In this way, there are virtually no limits in the way men can define themselves, but the possibilities of defining woman are fixed and relative to how man is defined. Thus, there is freedom in women wrenching control of the concept to positively define woman for themselves. Of course, this philosophical framework for gender understands gender to always be a power play. Fundamentally, certain groups of people exert their power over others by defining gender categories. Those who are oppressed resist their oppression by redefining gender categories for themselves. This framework then construes the social relationship between men and women as fundamentally being a power struggle. At heart, then, relational dynamics like love, servanthood, and self-sacrifice must be recast in terms of who is exerting power over whom. This empties love, servanthood, and self-sacrifice of much of their positive meaning. So now we get to Genesis and gender. I hope it is becoming obvious by now how the modern gender paradigm does not just disagree with the biblical view, but is fundamentally opposed to the biblical view of gender. Most fundamentally, the biblical view is based on the belief that God does in fact exist. Moreover, God has defined necessary conditions for understanding what a person is and what a man or a woman is. To quote Genesis chapter 1, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over the livestock and all the wild animals and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, 'Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground.'" End quote. First and most importantly, biblically, human beings are those creatures that bear God's image and are called to rule over the earth under God's authority. This means that there is objective value and dignity inherent in being human. Thus, basic human value and dignity is not merely socially constructed, and thus does not depend on whether a culture recognizes that value. More to the point, however, according to Genesis, God intentionally created two sexes. The Hebrew word used for male, zakah, and female, chabah, in Genesis, one can also refer to male or female animals, though the context here obviously refers to male and female humans, Hebrew Adam. Here it seems best to understand male and female to primarily pick out biological distinctions in Genesis 1 as opposed to social differences. This is because any social role that is given to male and female persons here is given to both, For instance, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth, rule over. No hierarchy between the sexes or differentiation in social responsibilities is stated. It is important to note that the biological distinctiveness of male and female enable them to fulfill their social responsibilities of procreating and ruling over the earth. Importantly, both male and female human beings are described as bearing God's image equally. In addition, human beings bear God's image prior to being commanded to fill the earth and rule over it. Thus, humans qua humans and human value exist independently and before human activity. While Genesis 1 picks out biological differences, these biological differences correspond to differences that diversify and make possible at least some social relationships in Genesis 2. In Genesis 2, the narrative shifts from using the Hebrew word Adam to describe human beings in general to describing one human being specifically, Ha-Adam. After naming the animals, the man, Ha-Adam, discovers that among the animals there is no other organism that is suited to be the man's co-ruler. There is no other human with which to share the distinctive calling that God has placed on the man, particularly to rule and fill the earth. At this point, God declares this solitary state is not good for the man and that God himself would craft a partner for the man. Out of the man's side, God takes a rib to fashion a woman, Isha. It would be clear to the readers of Genesis 2 that God's forming of the woman is different from the man whom he formed out of the dust of the earth. Thus, there seems to be intentional significance in fashioning the woman from the man's side. Carl Friedrich Kiel and Franz Delitzsch summarize, quote, "The woman was created not of dust of the earth, but from the rib of Adam, because she was formed for an inseparable unity and fellowship of life with the man," end quote. Thus, we find that God intended for social relationships between male and female human beings to be complementary and harmonious. Moreover, the mode of the woman's biological creation is intrinsically linked to her relationship with the man and the man mutatis mutandis. Not only is the mode of creation important, but sexed body differences are important. In her excellent exposition of biblical gender, Favale writes, quote, "We are talking about a body that is designed to fit another kind of body in an entirely unique way. Maleness points toward femaleness and vice versa. Our sexed body signals our inherent capacity and need for interpersonal communion," end quote. Once God presents the woman to the man breaks out into a love song. He rejoices that the woman is of the same nature as he, that she is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Distinguishing her from all the other animals, the man calls her woman, Isha, because she was taken from the man's, Ish, his side. Commentator Derek Kidner observes, quote, "The naming of the animals, a scene which portrays man as the monarch of all he surveys, poignantly reveals him as a social being made for fellowship, not power. He will not live until he loves, giving himself away to another on his own level. So the woman is presented wholly as his partner and counterpart. Nothing is yet said of her as childbearer. She is valued of herself alone," end quote. The relationship between the man and the woman then is to be one where the one who is brought out is reunited with the one from whom she was brought out. Of course, the first chapters of Genesis do not describe the first-person experience of being a man or a woman, but this seems to be part of the point. Genesis assumes that the male-female and man-woman distinction is woven into the very objective fabric of creation. Thus, fundamentally, necessary and sufficient biblical conditions for delineating a man or a woman are established by divine act and decree. As Favale points out, quote, "Divine speech makes reality. Human speech identifies reality. Reality that exists prior to our naming it, and our language is true and meaningful when it corresponds to what exists," end quote. Summarizing the biblical view of gender, the Bible presents the man-woman gender distinction as part of the created order established by God. Men and women are defined, at least in part, by their biological distinctiveness. Moreover, the distinctiveness between men and women is intended to be complementary. The attitude of the man toward the woman is to be an attitude that rejoices in their differences while recognizing their shared humanity and image-bearing capacity. So let's compare the two, the cultural view and this biblical view. I have attempted to explain how the biblical view of gender diverges from the contemporary cultural view. On the biblical account, God creates and establishes what it means to be both a human being and a man or woman. On the cultural view, we must define ourselves. On the biblical view, one's gender is grounded in one's biology. On the cultural view, gender categories are socially determined. On the biblical view, one's personhood and one's gender categories are things that one is. On the cultural, categories are socially determined. On the biblical view, one's personhood and gender categories are categories that one is. On the cultural view, one's personhood and gender are things that one does. On the biblical view, men and women are complementary. On the cultural view, men and women are opposed to one another, locked in an oppressive struggle. At first glance, it may seem that the cultural view offers a greater deal of freedom for the individual, and in some cases this is true. On the cultural view, persons have more choices that they can make. Namely, people have the additional choice of how to define man or woman. In addition, there seems to be a sense in which there is freedom in controlling whether we are becoming a man or a woman or something else. Yet, I think this freedom is misleading for a number of different reasons. First, as I have already argued, when the definition of man or woman is individually determined, statements like, "I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body," become unintelligible, thereby silencing how some people attempt to communicate their experience. On the biblical view, this kind of sentence conveys meaning because we can distinguish gender identity from gender. If one's identity is the set of beliefs one holds about oneself, and gender is an objectively identifiable trait, then one can hold beliefs about oneself that either correspond to or conflict with what someone really is. Second, if we must define ourselves, human being is one possibility that we are becoming. In this case, no one is ever fully and definitively human. In addition, one's value is not derived from who someone is, but what someone is becoming, or more literally, what someone does. Beauvoir implies as much in the first chapter of her work, The Ethics of Ambiguity. Quote, "One cannot start by saying that our earthly destiny has or has not importance, for it depends upon us to give it importance. It is up to man to make it important to be a man, and he alone can feel his success or failure." End quote. It is thus quite plausible that many people do not have importance because they have failed to live their lives in such a way that others have recognized the significance of their life projects. Moreover, on the cultural view, no one is really a man or a woman unless they have acted in the requisite ways of becoming a man or a woman. In contrast, the biblical view, one is a man or a woman regardless of whether the rest of society recognizes their gender. In fact, on Sartre's and Beauvoir's view, it is not clear that anyone actually is anything. They are only in the process of becoming something. Of course, there must be something that is in the process of becoming. Lastly, on the cultural view, gender is inherently oppressive. It is impossible for people to use gender language without privileging one group of people and oppressing another group. This means that if we want to talk about the love a woman has for a man, we have to recast love to expose the way in which it enables the impression of those labeled woman by those labeled man. In this way, traditional romantic love becomes just one more way of perpetuating the oppression of women by men. On the biblical view, however, romantic love is independent from and opposed to oppression. Biblical romantic love is best expressed when a man humbly serves a woman and vice versa. In this way, the biblical paradigm encourages the abdication of power in an attempt at meeting the needs of others in a way that is reminiscent of Christ's life and death. Furthermore, the biblical paradigm presents men and women as created to be complementary as opposed to being necessarily in conflict. In the Genesis narrative, neither Adam nor Eve could fulfill the purpose of humanity alone. Only together could they fill the earth and subdue it. So, In conclusion, I have explained and critiqued what I understand to be the wider cultural understanding of gender. On this view, gender is differentiated from biological sex and is either culturally determined or individually determined. I continue to explain and expose the philosophical underpinnings of the current cultural understanding, primarily in the writings of Simone de Beauvoir and others. In a nutshell, on their view, we are free to define ourselves because there is no God to define us. Moreover, we are urged to justify our existence and define ourselves by what we do. I contrasted the cultural view with what I've called the biblical view. On a biblical view, God created, defined, and endowed human beings with purpose prior to human activity. Additionally, God intentionally created two biologically distinct categories of humans, males and females, or men and women. Men and women were created to be complementary and fulfill social needs of each other. I have attempted to demonstrate that the biblical view is a better view than the cultural view. This is because the cultural view requires someone to act in certain ways to justify their existence. But the biblical view recognizes value in human beings in virtue of their being human. The cultural view understands gender to be purely socially constructed concept that is inherently oppressive. In contrast, the biblical view understands gender to pick out God-given complementary differences that are needed to perpetuate the purpose of humanity, thereby increasing human flourishing. In this way, gender differences are not oppressive, but they're worth celebrating. If the biblical view is true, a person's gender does not depend on the whims of changing culture. Whether someone is a man or a woman is an objective fact about oneself. Thus, we can talk meaningfully about the phenomenology of being a woman or being a man and how those experiences are similar or different. Thus, unlike the cultural view, the sentence, "I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body," conveys that one feels an incongruence between their biology and their experience. One feels that they experience the world as they believe a female experiences the world, even though they have a male body. Moreover, if the biblical view is true, cultures can be mistaken about how they understand man and woman. On a biblical view, the more a culture recognizes and celebrates the man-woman complementary distinction, the more a culture recognizes the divine image-bearing capacity of each gender, the better that society is, all else being equal. However, if the contemporary cultural view is correct, there can never be progress because there is no objective goal toward which progress points. If gender is ultimately determined by cultural consensus or by individual proclamation, there is no final standard by which to adjudicate which culture's view or which individual's view is better than another. Thus, the view that states that gender is biologically grounded and immutable is just as correct as the view that argues gender is inherently oppressive and ought to be abolished or redefined. A biblical view then allows us to evaluate gender paradigms as being better or worse, but the cultural view only allows us to recognize that different views of gender are different. In this way, the cultural view undermines itself because it provides no grounds for preferring the cultural view over a biblical one. Thank you. Yes, Denny. Oh, that's a great question. Okay. So what is a woman? And I'm going to try it. So if you want some further reading on this, I would highly recommend Abigail Favali's book, The Genesis of Gender. She's actually a gender studies professor that goes through her testimony is really, really interesting. And I'm trying to remember, I'm not going to get her definition quite right, but I think that this is a really good place. She says that a woman is someone whose body plan is organized around the capacity to gestate and bear new life. So I think that that's a really good definition of woman. What a woman is. What a man is, I'm working on it. Because like we would have to think of like part of what a man's purpose is and what it is, the kinds of his telos, and what are the fundamental characteristics of what a man is and what do those point to, I think would be the place where we'd start. Does that at least attempt to answer your question? Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. So this is interesting as I'm thinking about Beauvoir, and as she's like her whole point of the second sex in saying, okay, and she really cherry picks history, and I think the way that she deals with it. But as she's talking, her primary worry is that men have always been in control of society, and so they get to define everything, and that women gets always defined in contrast to that. But it's interesting to think about like what you're talking about. If man and woman are, but like they're designed to be complementary, then it's not necessarily a bad thing to define woman in contrast or in connection with man, especially insofar as we do it man in connection with woman. Yeah, I think that's really interesting. But yes, right here. Thank you. No, I haven't. My wife has. My wife has twice. And I hesitate to comment on it because I haven't seen it. I know that it tends to be like the subtext of it is much deeper than many popular movies are. I kind of wish I had seen it so far now because I do kind of want to comment on it, but I haven't seen it. So. Uh-huh. The definitive Free Will Baptist view. That's a little scary. I will say I have a friend that I think you know of, Jerome Van Kyken at Oklahoma Wesleyan, and we took our seniors up to Oakwoo last week. I drove that trip, and he presented a little bit of a critique, understanding, analysis of that movie. And basically, he fell back to Simone de Beauvoir and what it means to define ourselves. And he saw that as kind of a central feature of that film. I don't know. I don't think so. And he only spent about 10 or 15 minutes on it, so I'm not sure. Other questions, comments? I'll go over here first. Yeah. Just. Mm. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Mm-hmm. 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 That's a really good point. So for our online audience, what you're saying is that Abigail Favali comments that men and women have both experienced the fall, and we both experience effects of the fall, but often it seems that women tend to experience more of the brunt of that. And we might think of areas of subjugation, oppression, and stuff like that. And whether we have common ground with some feminist authors and their concerns. So I will say that I haven't thought a ton about that, but I think it's interesting. And I do think that there is something to that. And it's, as I'm thinking about it, I think that probably part of it is in the nature and the beauty of what the Bible describes as femininity and being a woman. That the flip side of that. So I'm thinking of Augustine here in terms of what evil is. That it's a privation of the good, and that this good thing about what it means to be a woman, particularly in the context of the male-female relationship, also at the same time makes her more vulnerable to certain kinds of abuse. So yeah, I do think that there's something there, and that's interesting. The reason so I think that the conclusion there is something that we might be able to find some common ground on. What we do with that, how we approach that, I think is going to be fundamentally different because people like Beauvoir and Butler and most Haslanger tends to be a little bit more obvious about it. They're operating from this neo-Marxist worldview wherein like that it's just what we have to fundamentally deconstruct Western society, period, in order to get away from the power. But if I understand someone like Foucault correctly, and they're definitely going to be along the lines of Foucault in this area, there is no cure. And I think this is where, so we can find common ground in saying that women tend to bear the brunt of this often, but where I think the Christian response is much more beautiful and much more satisfying and hopeful is that we know the cure, right? We know that Christ died for our sins. We know that Christ wants to redeem all things and that he wants to work through his people to do that kind of thing. Whereas someone like Haslinger or Butler or Beauvoir, at the end of the day, even if they succeed in dismantling Western culture, it's just them asserting their power. At the end of the day, it's just another cycle. Does that kind of talk to what you're talking about? Mm-hmm. Dr. Coons, you have another question? Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. No, that's good. So this irony, and I've thought the same thing that let's say that you have someone who's sincerely struggling with their gender identity. You know that I think that I am a woman, like I feel this way for certain kinds of reasons. And what do I do to pursue affirming that? I pursue changes to my physiology, and that implies, and I think not just implies, it assumes that if I'm trying changing my physiology assume or affirms my gender, therefore my gender is grounded in physiology. I'm just trying to change that. I think that is definitely a really deep irony here. And in terms of, yeah, it is called gender affirming care, and I'm sure it'll be later it'll be called something else. I think John Stonestreet says something really interesting about this. He's like, if it's gender affirming care, shouldn't it be helping someone to affirm the gender that they are? And I'm sure that language will change. Yeah, like I said, because of the point that you point out that, okay, the language here, what exactly are we trying to go for? But I think to expose a little bit more of, and I think this is something that I didn't address here because this is another paper in itself, but the role that language plays. So this is going to, speaking to this irony that you're talking about, one of the things that flows out of postmodern philosophy and really actually starts in structuralism, post-structuralism. If you've done hermeneutics, you've probably touched on some of this, is that language essentially determines reality. And so if we can determine our language, then we can determine our reality. But what I think is interesting is we're all going to bump into reality at some point, that language is only so flexible. And as Favali points out, that divine language creates, human language recognizes. Does that kind of speak to what you were talking about? Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's a great question. So how can the church practically deal with some of these questions? Well, first, I would ask that to remember that regardless of how outwardly different or unique or weird that someone seems, that they are still created in the image of God. And there are many people, when someone struggles with transgenderism, I use this word struggle intentionally, that it's not something most of the time that they just woke up one day and were like, hey, you know what I think? I think I'm going to try this today. Right? There tends to be very deep-seated psychological things that are intertwined with it. In fact, there was a study that was done, I think it was in the mid to late 80s, that was looking at what we call now gender dysphoria. And what they found was something like 70 to 80% of the people who were diagnosed with gender dysphoria also had some other comorbidity. So they're also struggling with depression or other kinds of mental health issues. So first of all, as we're talking with our congregations, to remember that people are people. And second, to remember that maybe that speaking the truth in love is a good thing. So it's going to be hard sometimes. Sometimes we're going to get people are going to be angry at us, upset with us. But again, on the biblical view, it's true regardless. So that we can speak truth in love. And if we don't speak truth, then we do hurt people. If we don't expose lies, we do hurt people. So finding the courage and the reason to speak about the beauty, and this is the way I would really orient it, because the biblical narrative here is so beautiful. It's not just a rote commandment of here's what gender is and here are how men or women are supposed to interact. It's more than that, right? It's aesthetically pleasing. It touches us in our innermost parts. It really does speak to our existence. And so as we're talking about this truth, just to keep those kinds of things in mind. Does that help at all? Okay.